Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of 2 Samuel. Actually, it's the beginning of the book of 2 Samuel. And we'll kind of pick up where chapter 31 of 1 Samuel ended. And of course, I know I've mentioned this in the other studies that we've done, but the way that this is laid out, it really is one volume, if you will. We've broken it into two, 1 and 2 Samuel, mainly because it's where the life of Saul ends at chapter 31, and the life of David as the king kind of picks up. So it's been divided into these two pieces, but it really is intended to be one volume. And if you're looking at it in a Jewish Bible, you're going to find that it's just one book. So the division between 1 and 2 is really kind of just to help topically for us to understand that when it comes to the kings, 1 Samuel deals with not only Samuel the prophet and David and other characters, but it focuses in on the kingship of Saul, whereas the second book of Samuel is dealing with the life of David as the king. So we're going to just kind of take care of the first two chapters because there's, again, a bit of a split in the information that we get from chapter 3. Now, again, it's a continuing narrative, but here's something that you don't maybe necessarily think of. And I know that I've said it in the general sense that it was a united kingdom under Saul and David and Solomon. But the beginning of David's time was, there was division in the early part of it. And we get that picked up in chapter 2. What we'll deal with first in chapter 1 clearly is the transition that takes place, and the overlap of the two books is kind of evident because what was taking place in the death of Saul at the end of 1 Samuel, we know that David had been pulled to the south because some of the Philistines didn't want David involved in the battle that ended up killing Saul. And so David comes back to his place. If you studied the last one that we did, you'd see that what had taken place, David went to the south back to the home where he had Ziklag, and come to find out that the Amalekites had done just basically pillaged the whole place, taken the families and wealth and all kinds of it, plus a number of other places where they had gone and just ravaged the area. So David is brought to the place of collecting them back up. We've studied that over the last couple of studies of looking at the battle and what all led to it. But chapter 2, 2 Samuel, the beginning chapter, is where David gets the information. And again, it's a very curious circumstance that happens where the news comes to David. And when you first read it, David's reaction seems very odd, considering what all was reported to him. And yet, as we know of the life of David and the times that he was able to take the life of Saul, he would not do it because he honored the idea that Saul, no matter what he may have had with him in the personal level of things, still saw him as God's anointed, the person that God had put his seal upon as the king. Now, David knows, obviously, by this time that he's already been anointed by Samuel a long time ago. Samuel is long since passed. But David would understand that his anointing as king was for a future time while Saul was alive. They wouldn't be kind of co-regents. And so as far as David was concerned, clearly, as long as Saul was alive, Saul would be alive because of the desire of God. And because of that, David would never look to assert his place in this. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to be an easy transition, as we're going to see in chapter 2. It's not an easy transition because there is still the desire from some very, very powerful people to see the kingly line continue through the life of Saul and the tribe of Benjamin. And yet David is from the tribe of Judah. We're going to find out as we get into chapter 7 of this and what we see with David. God has other plans. The kingly line is going to continue through David's line, through the tribe of Judah, because obviously the promise of the person of Jesus is going to have a major role in that. And we'll get to that in short order. By the third chapter, what we're going to find is detail that shows that there's already kind of a split in even the northern part. So there was, for a very short time, a northern contingent, if you will, and a southern one. And so David would have been in the south, and then the descendants, Ishbosheth in this case, the son of Saul, was going to be in the north. So there was division. It's nothing like the division that we will see as we go through this line of the kings and going through Samuel's and Kings and Chronicles. We're going to find that the split, once it happened after Solomon's time, between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, was a forever split. It wasn't something that consolidated back into a united kind of a kingdom that it would be under David. So we'll see that kind of develop. It won't take all that long. But initially, there is this vacuum that happens when Saul is gone, and there is rivaling attempts to install different kings. Now, we obviously know who the man of God's choosing is, and so that will be evident very, very soon. Now, one thing I want to do, it's just kind of a recap very briefly. When I look at the 8th chapter of 1 Samuel, that's when you first, if you're just now jumping into this and haven't had a chance to go back and see them, it's probably best to pick up at 1 Samuel chapter 1 at the beginning of when we studied it. But this is coming out of the time of the judges. And for the time that the judges served, that was, off and on, there were good times, bad times in it, was hundreds of years from the death of Joshua. The problem was, for a variety of reasons, and you can go back and watch it, there was just never anyone like Joshua after he had passed. So from Moses to Joshua was a very clean transition. After Joshua, there was just really kind of a mess. And so the nation itself had really began to fail spiritually. And there were some things that you could say that Joshua, it might have been better had he done some things differently. Under Joshua, the people never actually occupied the land entirely because they never ran off the surrounding nations that God told them to remove and get out. And that only got worse under Saul. And so we see that there was always problems with the Philistines, who never should have been there. When it comes to the ones, the Amalekites who had attacked Ziklag, that David has just freed, should again never be in the land. So all of these non-Jewish people should not be in the nation of Israel according to what God had said. Get them out, and the reason why is that they're going to be a constant irritant to you. And of course, the problem with their spirituality and their wickedness would be something that is seen throughout the history from the time that Israel comes into the land. So that's a lot of stuff that we've covered. You can go back and if you haven't, you can check out the studies in Joshua, and then going into Kings and Judges and all that. We covered a lot of this information again in times past, a number of times. But it's important for us to recap it here. So by the time that chapter 8 of 1 Samuel rolls around, they have a king. They've wanted a king. They've asked for it. God doesn't want them to have it, yet they insist. So God allows them to have one, tells Samuel to allow them to do what they're going to do. And basically what God ends up saying is that their rejection is not of me, or not of you, Samuel, but their rejection is of me. Let them have what they want, even after the warnings. And so they get Saul. Saul is a man who just never really lays hold of all that God would have done through him. Having a king was not God's plan, but God wasn't going to punish them simply because they wanted a king. He would be anointing Saul not only for the position as king, but we've studied already that God's presence was upon him, and God would empower him to be a godly man and a godly leader. So though it wasn't God's choice, he wasn't going to punish them for their choice. In David, he's not the choice of the people necessarily. The people in the south loved him, but those people that were obviously influenced by Saul didn't like him either. So David is the man that God had chosen. Even during Saul's life, Samuel was sent to the house of Jesse, went through all of his sons. David was the last one, the improbable one. And now he's the man that God has said he'll be the successor. And there's going to be an incredible contrast. We've already seen it, but it is profound, the difference between Saul and David. And we'll see the way that David handles things. It's very, very clear that these are very different men. So let's pick up at chapter 1, and let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We ask, Lord, that you would open our eyes to what we see here and understand why it's important, why we should know this history, and why it is important, the things that we can glean from David and his wisdom, the things that he shows to us, and the qualities that he has. We ask, Lord, that we would see those things from the text. As we study through the history, may we make proper application. So we give you all thanks and praise and ask that you'd glorify yourself through the teaching of your word this evening. We ask it in Jesus' name. And I say evening, it may be morning when you're watching this. It was evening when I recorded this, and here's the truth about that. If you've never heard me say it, no matter if I say the wrong thing, if it's night and I say day, it's always daytime or nighttime anywhere in the world at some time. So you can never be wrong with that. Just a little bit of extra information. 2 Samuel chapter 1 says this. Now, it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, and David had stayed 2 days at Ziklag. So what this is kind of a crossover of that time. As David is coming back to that place, the war has already taken place, and David he doesn't know what has taken place to this point. He's about to get a report of it. Doesn't know what all's taken place. He's just kind of in the dark about the whole thing. So at verse 2, but on the third day, behold, it happened that a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And so it was when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrate himself. And David said to him, where have you come from? And so he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. Now, I'm going to put up a map right here, and I'm going to leave it up for a few moments. Go ahead and screen capture it, because it fits for not only what we're looking at here, but also for chapter 2, because it will help you to understand some of the cities that we know about, and there are place names that we do know and place names that we don't know. So it's kind of important that we're able to understand where these places were and what took place at those areas. So I'll put it up there. It's best to screen capture it. If you have trouble doing that, send me an email and I'll be happy to send you a copy of it. And so I can do that through email. So David said to him, how did the matter go? Please tell me. And he answered, the people have fled from the battle. Many of the people are fallen dead, and Saul and Jonathan are dead also. And so David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead? And so the young man told him, saying, I happened by chance to Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and indeed the chariots and the horsemen followed hard after him. Now, the report that's given here is absolutely contradictory to what we read already, and he's going to go on, and he's going to give more information that is absolutely inaccurate. So there's not a contradiction, as some might allege that there is. We can see that this guy is clearly giving a very bad record because he's looking to find favor with David. If Saul is dead, everybody pretty much realizes that David is really kind of the next of the powers that are going to come onto the scene. So what better to do than to bring a report and then bring something to David and make it a sympathetic story that you're really there on David's side and all the rest of it. He concocts what is a story. I don't think there's any real doubt to it, but he miscalculates the way that David is going to answer this. So this man brings what is clearly a bogus story. Now, the one thing that we don't know for sure, was David wise to this? Did it sound just too improbable, and does this man just come off to David as opportunistic? And then David passes a judgment upon him, which we'll see in a moment. But however that works out, the passage doesn't really tell us. So all we can do is kind of try to figure some things out. Does David believe his story entirely? We don't know. Does he have his suspicions? Again, we don't know. but by this man's own admission and by what we do know of David, if nothing else, if David believed 100% that his story was accurate, David would have still responded the same way. And we'll get to it in just a moment as it comes up. So, in verse 7, so when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me and answered, and I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? And so I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And so he said to me again, please stand over me and kill me, for anguish has come upon me, but my life still remains in me. It's a complete lie from what we saw before. Because remember, Saul knew that he was mortally wounded. He asked the armor bearer to do this, to kill him. The armor bearer couldn't do it, so Saul killed himself, and then the armor bearer killed himself as well. So when he happens upon Saul, Saul must have been dead by this time because he collects some of the valuables from Saul. And we're going to see his reasoning why he did this thing. Thinking, once again, that it's going to gain him some kind of favor with David, and it's a terrible miscalculation on his part, which we'll see. So, in verse 10 it says, so I stood over him, I killed him because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, my Lord. So this guy is figuring, I'm going to get great reward for this. So everything about this is inaccurate because when he says he stood over him and killed him, we know that that's not how it went down. So he concocts this whole story. There's no one there to refute it. By the time he's come upon them, at minimum, in the general proximity of Saul, is we know for sure Saul and for his armor bearer, they both died in the same place. Somehow this guy came upon them. It must have been that he had to have been close in proximity because we know that there was a lot of other things going on at the time. Now, Gilboa is in the portion of the Jezreel Valley. As you've had a chance to look at the map, you'll see Gilboa, and you're able to kind of piece it together because Jezreel is to the north of it, and also Bet Shean is a little bit to the north and to the east of it. So we know that that's Bet Shean is the place where Saul and Jonathan and his other sons were taken and put on display. The men of Jabesh Gilead come to get them. You're going to see that Jabesh Gilead and another place that you'll see where Ishbosheth is going to be set up is on the east side of the Jordan River. We always think of Israel as being everything on the west side. We're going to get to that in a moment, and I'll explain a little bit in case we forget about the land allotment. We'll explain all that when we get there. So, the report comes to David. Fanciful, makes this guy seem like kind of the hero, that I could see that Saul's wound was a mortal wound, and I did the thing that should be done, and that was to make sure that the Philistines didn't do something to him. And so I did as he had requested, and here I am standing before you, David. Here is the crown, because you're the king. Here are the bracelets. This is all the valuables, and I didn't let it fall into anyone else's hands. Here they are for you. Guy's thinking that he's going to be treated as a hero. So David took hold of his own clothes, and he tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. This is that sign of mourning. That idea of, ashes and torn clothes and all the rest of that. That's a sign of outward grief and mourning. Now, why would David do such a thing? Was it phony? I don't think it was phony at all. Now, David fully realizes that Saul was kind of crazy at most of the time of that we know of. The relationship between he and David was, of course, incredibly envious of him. But Saul was just a weird guy about a number of different things. In fact, if you remember, even his son Jonathan, who died next to him or with him in the area, also he had made an attempt on his life, as serious as it may have been. Nonetheless, he did so many things that were just outside of the norm, just a strange guy when it comes to this. So here this guy brings this information. David, I believe his mourning is absolutely heartfelt, and we're going to see in his own words, because he wants people to commemorate the lives of Jonathan and of Saul. So then it says in verse 12, so they mourned and they wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. So his mourning was everything that is Saul, from his life to his family to really the whole northern part of the kingdom, has now fallen to the Philistines. Now remember, David has been living among the Philistines, and the Philistines had thought David to be an ally. What we were able to take from the latter parts of 1 Samuel was that David lived in a separate area at his own request, and he was living to the east of where the king of Gath would be, and all the Philistine places. So he'd been living to the east of it, and was able to kind of keep all of the southern parts of the invading kind of countries and kingdoms from making their way and pillaging Israel, but he was able to look like he was doing it to protect the Philistines. And we see that when he has his discussions with Agag and all that stuff. So we've already covered all of that, and it's there. You can go back and check those studies out. We went through all of that. So verse 13. So David says to the young man who told him, "Where are you from?" And so he answered, "I'm a son of an alien, an Amalekite." And so David said to him, "How was it that you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" So David asks him a simple question. This didn't seem a frightful thing to you to kill the anointed king of Israel? So this is an alien living among the people, and he should have known who Saul was, and nobody should lift their hands to Saul. This is by David's standard, clearly, because we know on 2 occasions that David had ample opportunity to kill Saul. Both times he told Saul, "I could have taken your life, but I would never do that." And remember the reason why he said, "You are the Lord's anointed. Who am I that I would do such a thing?" So if David sees himself as a son of Abraham, who is an Amalekite that he would feel somehow it's okay to do this thing? And David is, whether he bought his story or only a portion of the story, whatever it was, totally separate issue. David sees this guy of, who are you to do what God gives to take his life? And so we see in verse 14, so David said to him, "How is it that you were not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" So then David called for one of the young men and said to him, "Now go near and execute him. He has struck him so that he has died." And so David said to this man, "Your blood is on your own hand. Of your own mouth, by your own mouth, you have testified against yourself, saying, 'I have killed the Lord's anointed.'" So, first part of the story, David gets the information. Now, had it been some unknown, battle with the Philistines, you'll never know who it was that did it. This guy makes up a story, and again, we don't know how much of it David bought, doesn't matter. David's reaction is still the same. David would never have taken Saul's life no matter what. Here this man has done it, thinking that he's done something good. David says, "That's not your place to do it. You have confessed to a murder, and so your life is going to be required of you. Who are you that you would do this thing?" So, what is David's reaction? We know how it was between David and Jonathan. They were like brothers. They were as close could be. David has this amazing ability to look at Saul as the man that God has put in that place, as the king. He realizes that Saul is just nuts as far as his hatred towards David and his jealousy of David. But David puts that in a different category. Saul is nonetheless God's anointed. He is the king. David's not going to lift a finger against him. David is also going to see him as the king over Israel, and that he had, apparently, as David must be accounting for it, he had Israel's interest at heart. He defended them. Now, of course, he didn't do so very well towards the end, especially. The Philistines are very much on the rise, and they could have been, the Philistines didn't have to be much of a rival had Saul walked before the Lord as David will, and we'll see how the things go between David and the Philistines. It's a whole different life between them. The way that Saul handled them, the way that David handled them. And the one thing that is the major difference between those two men, Saul did not have his life right with the Lord. In fact, he killed the priests. We've seen all that stuff. David is going to be the total, complete opposite. So how does David handle this whole thing? Verse 17. David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. He told them to teach it to the children of Judah, the song of the bow. Indeed, it is written in the book of Jasher. Now, again, the book of Jasher, unknown to us. Doesn't matter. We have a record of it here as far as Samuel is concerned. So here is the this poem. It's to be recited. It's to be remembered, and it is a commemoration of Saul and of his son Jonathan. The beauty of Israel is slain on your high places, and the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, and lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. And then he mentions Gilboa. So this is addressed, if you will, as though Gilboa is being spoken to. And on you is where our king was put to death. Now, of course, he says, don't speak about this in those places where the Philistines are. Don't let them have some glory in this. Don't let them rejoice. And so he turns his attentions to, O mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew nor rain upon you, nor fields of offerings, for the shield of the mighty is cast away there, the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain and from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. So this is his way of looking at the exploits of these men and their valor and all the rest. He's about to say a little bit more. Now, before I go too much further, if you again pull up that map that's there, just remember when you look at Mount Gilboa, there are some interesting things that took place there. This is the place where Gideon had his whole episode against the Midianites. So that's that whole story of Gideon during the time of the judges and of the 300 men and the springs that were there, all that stuff, same area. It's that same mountainous area that we go and visit. And it's a place that we see every trip that we take to Israel. And beautiful, beautiful area. It's in the lowlands, kind of in the Jezreel Valley, or the Valley of Armageddon, whatever you want to call it. But that valley that runs from kind of north to south and from the west to the east, it's diagonal, your direction. It goes this way. So it goes from the west towards the east, and it goes downward, so from north to south. And it's that diagonal valley. It's very, very long, very big. But on a clear day, you can see from Carmel all the way to Gilboa. So there's a lot of history in that valley, and history still to be made in it. But as you look at Gilboa, and there's plenty of pictures there, you can look for pictures of a place called En Harod. That's Gideon's spring. That's Gilboa. That's that whole area. A lot of different things go on there. So historically, anyway. So you have a number of significant things took place. Here David is calling for a lament and addressing as though Gilboa was a place that could answer these things or to be spoken to. He speaks of Gilboa and this idea that don't let dew or rain fall upon you. It's that idea, let it be a place of desolation for this time. So Saul and Jonathan were beloved and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, and they were stronger than lions. So even in verse 23, you can see David is able to compartmentalize things here. David puts his own problems that he had between he and Saul and puts those things aside. The focus of this is Saul and Jonathan. This is from the king that is the successor to look back to the first king and to his son Jonathan and to memorialize them and to think of them fondly for who they were. It has nothing to do with David's problems that he had with Saul, that Saul initiated, not David. It was Saul who was the one putting those things in place. So he says, O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxury and who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Isn't that interesting? How the mighty have fallen. We use that term a lot. Probably don't realize that it was popularized here by David 3,500 years ago. So, I'm sorry, about 3,000 roughly. So, how the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan was slain in your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love for me was wonderful, surpassing even the love of a woman. This was brotherly love. So, different kind, of course, but it's just speaking about that closeness, like brother to brother type of thing. It's different than even the love that there could be between man and woman. There was a bond and a friendship that was there that endured through it. So, he doesn't commemorate Saul in the same way that he does of Jonathan. because the friendship and the relationship that they had, it's like they were of one soul. They were just that close as friends. And so he doesn't have the same things. He can't say those same things about Saul and have it be honest, but he's honestly able to say these things about Jonathan. So once again, he says, how the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war, how they have perished. So he completes this lament, and it is, again, to be a commemoration of the loss of Saul and the loss of Jonathan in this battle. So then chapter 2 is the natural follow-on of what had taken place because of this battle. So it happened after this day that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up to any of the cities in Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. And then so David said, then where should I go up? And he said, to Hebron. So this question that David has for him is twofold. And this again, I always point this out. I want to always point this out. It's very important for us. David wants to know specifics. He doesn't just throw out something, get a partial answer, and go running off. He wants to know the whole of the matter. So this is his way of saying, do you want me to set up my kingdom, God? And if so, where? Do I go up into some place? Where do you want me to put things in place? Again, reference back to that map, because it really helps to understand where David's territory was and where the territory in the north was of Ishbosheth, so the son of Saul. We're about to be introduced to all of that and why that's important. But you'll find out where Hebron is. Hebron is to the south of Jerusalem. And sometimes even today you'll hear about Hebron, and it's mentioned as being in the West Bank. It's under the authority of the Palestinian Authority. So Israel allows that. As far as Ishbosheth is concerned, he's going to have the whole northern territory, and we're going to see one of the names of the places is going to be mentioned. And I'll make a comment about that again. Pulling up the map, you can see that it's important that we know where this is and why it is that they would be settling where they did. So it says, so David, he went there, and his two wives, Ahinoam and then Abigail. And David brought up the men who were with him, every man with his household. And so they dwelt in the cities of Hebron. This would be the capital of the southern part while this is all getting sorted out of Ishbosheth and David. David is going to be the king, clearly. That will just be, it's a matter of time is all that it is. Temporarily, he settles in Hebron, and all of his people with him, those who are his men of valor, his army, if you will, they encamp and they live in the area of Hebron. So David sent messengers, verse 4. So then the men of Judah, they came, and then they anointed David the king over the house of Judah. Notice how he mentions the southern part, over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. So that the news comes back. He hears from the guy, here's what happened to Saul and to Jonathan. Now, word comes to David and says the men of Jabesh Gilead are the ones who, when they heard that Saul had been taken to Bet Shean, they went and got his body, that of Jonathan and the sons, and they got his armor. They took it all. It wasn't going to be on display for the Philistines to be able to gloat. These men took it into their own hands to do it. Now, Jabesh Gilead, when you look at that map, you're going to see that it is on the eastern side of the Jordan. And there are a number of things that are over there. And again, I said earlier, we think of Israel as being bordered by the Jordan River to the east, like from the Sea of Galilee all the way down to the Dead Sea. The River Jordan is the dividing line. But remember, when they first came into the land, when Moses was still alive, you had Reuben and Gad and Manasseh, half of Manasseh's tribe. And Jabesh Gilead, if that's where it was, is in the northernmost of that part of the tribal allotment. Gad and Reuben were further to the south. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it went Gad, Reuben, and then that half tribe of Manasseh. That's kind of the area where Jabesh Gilead would be. So if that's the correct place. Anyway, it's kind of incidental. But what we do know is that when you look at a map, it's actually the eastern part of the Jordan River. There were those places where 2.5 of the tribes of Israel were allowed to stay while the rest of them came in and took their land allotments. So David hears that the men of Jabesh Gilead had done this. And where Hebron is, when you look at where Jabesh Gilead, the general area, it's a long ways away. But news comes to David of what's taken place. And notice that this southern king, Judah, hears of this and really is thankful to the men of Jabesh Gilead for not allowing Jonathan and the other sons of Saul, along with Saul and all the trophies, to remain in the hands of the Philistines. That's what's going on here. So verse 5, so David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead, and he said to them, "You are blessed of the Lord." Why is that? "For you have shown this kindness to your Lord, to Saul, and you have buried him. And now may the Lord show kindness and truth to you. I also will repay your kindness because you have done this thing. Now therefore, let your hands be strengthened and be valiant, for your master Saul is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me to be king over them." Isn't it a cool thing that David is able to say, and making these overtures to the people of Jabesh Gilead who are in Saul's territory? Now, David has been removed from them for some time because of the threats of Saul. David is saying, "I'm thankful for what you did for your Lord, the King Saul, and just know that I will be kind towards you. I have no problems. I'm thankful for what you guys have done. So just know this. I will repay your kindness in kind." Really, really good thing that he does. But, verse 8, notice the difference. Abner, the son of Ner, he was the commander of Saul's army. He took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. What you're finding again, that's on the other side of the Jordan. It's to the south of Jabesh Gilead. Again, we're not entirely sure where it is. There's debate on the whole thing. We do know that it is still to the other side, whatever the possible places are. It's in what is modern day Jordan. So that's the area where they are. And so what Abner does, Abner is a nephew, or Saul was Abner's nephew, and you're going to find that he wants to set up somebody in Saul's family line. So he wants to see it go to and stay in the family. So he props up this one son of Saul. Saul had lost several sons in that battle, but this one survived, Ishbosheth, and he sets him up. And verse 8 says, he made him king over Gilead, over the Asherites, so the tribe of Asher. This is all the stuff that's in the north. Over Jezreel and over Ephraim and over Benjamin and over all of Israel, basically the whole northern territory where they had settled. So again, if you reference that map that I put up at the beginning, it kind of gives you the outline of where that is based on the tribal allotments. So it tells us Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. So those were the only ones who were behind David at the time. And you'll see it says in verse 11, and at that time David was the king of Hebron over the house of Judah. He was there for 7 years and for 6 months. Now we're going to find out as we go through this how that all works out. And what happens in the succession. In the next few chapters, we get where this commentary is, who reigned for how long in what area. There becomes an explanation. We'll find out all the details on that coming up here pretty quick. So verse 12 says, now Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went from Mahanaim to Gibeon. Now, again, Gibeon is going to be to the south. It's kind of a generalized type of an area, I guess you could say, and so the towns and all that, but they're coming to the south. Now, what they're trying to, it's really kind of an odd thing. They already know from the beginning, the idea that David is in the south and that now they've made one of Saul's sons the king in the north, there's going to be conflict. And it's interesting how they find, let's settle the conflict this way that doesn't last at all. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them by the pool at Gibeon. And so they sat down, one on one side of the pool and the others on the other side of the pool. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and compete before us." And Joab said, "Then let them arise." Joab, David's representative, and then Abner, Ishbosheth, and the north. He's their person. So it is the northern person, Abner, who says, how about we just select a few groups of guys and let's let them battle it out and let's try to settle the territorial thing. Of course, this was never going to work. So Abner said to Joab, let the young men arise. So they arose, they went over by number, 12 from Benjamin, followers of Ishbosheth and of Saul, the son of Saul, and 12 from the servants of David. So what there was, wherever the men that were from David didn't necessarily have to be from Judah, from the tribe, but they were followers of David who was in Judah. So there, it says, each one grasped his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into the opponent's side, and so they fell down together. Therefore the place was called the Field of Sharp Swords, which is in Gibeon, or the Field of Sharp Edges is another possible translation of this. So here's the picture. They decide, we'll pick an equal number and let them battle it out. They all died together. Nothing was settled, except for, now you have these men dead and nothing has happened. So it's just going to become what they didn't want it to become. It's going to become a war. So there was a very fierce battle that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So David's army had overcome them. Now there's a chase that's going to be taking place. Now, the three sons of Zeruiah, they were Joab, Abishai, and Ashael. And Ashael was fleet of foot and as a wild gazelle. Now, Zeruiah is the sister of David. So these are David's nephews that have gone. And so it tells us Ashael pursued after Abner and in going, he did not turn to the right or to the left from following after Abner. So here is the brother of Joab, who's pretty fast. He starts going after Abner. He's going to finish this thing out. But Abner's a man of war, so kind of interesting. Abner looked behind him, and he said, "Are you Ashael?" And he answered, "I am." And so Abner said to him, "Now turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and lay hold of one of these other young men, and take his armor for yourself." But Ashael would not turn aside from following him. And Abner said to Ashael, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I face your brothers?" So there's a couple of different possibilities for why he says turn to one of these guys. Like suit up and let's do this? Or is it a different way of basically saying, go after one of these guys and he'll continue on his way? Well, as it is, Abner says, if you come at me like you're coming at me, you're going to die. Why should you die? Is basically his taunt to him. So Abner said again to Ashael, verse 22, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? And how then could I face your brother Joab? I don't want to have to see your brother and explain to him that I killed you." So he's not mocking him. I think at this point, Abner realizes he's done a pretty dumb thing, but he's kind of a conniver anyway. This didn't have to happen in the first place. There was no reason why he had to lay his hands on Ishbosheth and try to make a rival king. It should have been known, of course it had to have been known to Abner at the time, that David was the one who was anointed to be king. Saul knew it. If Saul knew it, then you know that Abner knew it too. But he doesn't want any part of this. He's going to see that this thing turns into a complete war. However, what we see is that he refused to turn aside. Therefore, Abner struck him in the stomach with the blunt end of his spear so that the spear came out of his back. It's gruesome when you think about it. It's kind of like just the rounded end of it, but there was so much momentum coming from Abishai that he runs him right through. So just gruesome. And so it was that as many as came to that place where Ashael was the one who died. When they came to the place where Ashael fell down dead and then stood still. So the people that were also in pursuit, when they came to him, they just stood. So Joab and Abishai also pursued Abner, and the sun was going down when they came to the hill at Amah, and which was before Giah on the road to the wilderness of Gibeon. So they're going back to the north from where they had started. So this whole thing, now everybody has stopped, and it's about to start all over again. Now, at this point, we can see that Abner knows They're pretty much beaten at this point. And so he does what would be kind of a desperation thing. But watch the reaction. It's just a different thing. I don't know that you would have seen the same kind of reaction from Abner if the tables were turned. But it tells us a little bit about Joab. Joab's an interesting man. We're going to find a lot about him as we go on. So, now the children of Benjamin gathered together behind Abner, and they became a unit, and they took their stand on top of a hill. Then Abner called to Joab and said, "Shall the sword devour forever?" Now, Joab, if he was anything like I think Abner is, he pretty much could have said, "Hey, we didn't start it. Besides, you killed my brother." Now, even though Abner could have said, "Well, I told him to back away, but he wouldn't do it." Let's put all that aside. There's no sense in going down that rabbit hole. So, Abner called to Joab, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that it will be bitter in the latter end? How long will it be then until you tell the people to return from pursuing their brethren?" When are you going to call your guys off? Because where does this end? How many of us need to fall? So you can look at this one of two ways. Is Abner just looking to save his own skin? Or, boy, it's not a good idea because it could just weaken our ranks, which is one of the things that he says. Whatever his intention, Joab hears it and realizes the wisdom of it. If nothing else, it's going to so thin the ranks. They already have a problem known as the Philistines. The Philistines have just defeated the northern part of the country, and they've just killed Saul and his sons. So if the men of Israel continue to fight one another, they're going to deplete their ranks, and the Philistines are a real issue. And so he uses that as his reasoning. So Joab said, "As God lives, unless you had spoken, surely then by morning all the people would have given up pursuing their brethren." So we were going to continue this thing. Of course it would have happened, but it's better that we stop right here as you've said. And so then Joab blew a trumpet, and all the people stood and did not pursue Israel anymore, nor did they fight anymore. Then Abner and his men went on all night through the plain, crossed over the Jordan, and went through Bithron, and they came to back to where the king had been set up. So they come back to Ishbosheth. Now Joab returned from pursuing Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing David's servants only 19 plus Ashael. That means you've lost 20 men in this battle, and that's all. And then notice it says, "But the servants of David had struck down of Benjamin and Abner's men 360 men who had died." So very one-sided, very lopsided. Here's the interesting thing. If Ishbosheth and Abner stopped to take inventory of this, and David and Joab would look at this, they could realize, probably more so than just we were better prepared than they were, we were maybe better warriors and everything else, God seems to have made it very evident who should be considered as the leader here, and who he was backing, if you will, or making sure was victorious. So it tells us that the servants of David struck down of Benjamin 360 men that day. And then they took up Ashael, and they buried him in his father's tomb, which was in Bethlehem. And Joab and his men went all night, and then they came to Hebron at daybreak. So on the way home, they drop off his brother. They come back and they tell David what's going on. Now, from chapter 3, we're going to see that already there becomes a problem, and Abner is going to have to leave from the north. So already the intrigue begins. Didn't have to happen like this. It should have been totally different. It should have been David was the rightful man, and that Saul had died, and so now was David's reign. Instead, it's that same way of trying to just keep power to yourself and just kind of the nepotism that would be seen as kings. But God did not choose Ishbosheth. He had chosen David, and so David is going to be that king. So we'll see that play out in the next chapters. We're going to find a very, very interesting chapter in just a few where you see that God promises to David a kingdom that would last forever. And we'll look at all of the biblical implications of that and the prophetic implications of that, because they're staggering. So with all that said, this is just kind of the intrigue that happened after the death of Saul and how it relates to the next king that would be taking place, David, and then what's going to happen for the pursuit of the power over the nation, and we'll see that all gets worked out. But again, it's really kind of a settled issue at this point. We already know because God has already anointed him. Remember what he had said to Samuel is that God is, like Samuel kept looking at the boys and thought, none of these guys are the guys. God says no to all of them. And the runt of the litter is going to be that guy, the young one, the one that doesn't look like the rest of them necessarily. And God says, I don't look at the outside, I look at the inside. David's going to be that man for the entirety of his kingdom. Though he's not perfect, still he's got a different way about him, and he has a reliance upon the Lord that's different. So with all of that said, again, I put up maps and things like that from time to time. And if you are unable to load them, as already mentioned earlier, contact me. And you can do so through our ministry website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And you'll see that there's an email that's there, and you can send me an email and I'll return them back to you, just the pictures of the maps if you aren't able to find them on your own. Now, you usually can find them pretty readily online. Maps are pretty easy to come by if you want to, and we'll be happy to. If you can't, though, anyway, we can send you some. So with that, one other thing on the YouTube channel. If you are watching these on YouTube and not through the website, then feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel and pass it around to your friends. Let them know that we've got this here and we put out content, Old Testament and New Testament, and subscribing to it lets you know when we're putting up content. I have a series of topical things that I'm going to want to do here very shortly. Those will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. And we'd love to have you, weigh in on any of those. If you have any questions, again, feel free to contact us and like the YouTube channel. And we will see you at chapter 3, for chapter 3, and probably 4 next time that we get together. And so until then, I pray that God blesses you as you pursue him in his word.